Welcome to the Western Illinois University Social Justice Summit. My name is Jill Bisbee, and I'm your host for this session, along with my colleague, Kelly Larrabee.
Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Larrabee, and I echo Jill's welcome and am delighted you're joining us today. Thank you for your participation. We would like to express our sincere appreciation to the Quad Cities Grad Center for sponsoring today's webinar, along with our esteemed colleagues. We'll begin in just a few moments, but first Jill will review the Zoom features we will be using today in our seminar.
The toolbar is located on the bottom of your screen. The Q&A button allows you to send questions and comments to the presenter at any time during this session. We'll stop periodically to address what has been submitted and answer more at the end of the session as time permits. The Q&A button is also our logistics hub for today. Use it as a resource to let us know about technology issues you might be having, and we'll do our best to address those. Different from Zoom meetings that you've been using in the past few months, we will not utilize the chat function or the raise your hand function so that everything funnels to us through the Q&A button. Today's session is the third in a series of 4 webinars focused on equity and inclusion within higher education. We are pleased to bring you Actualizing, Racial Justice, Decolonization in Settled and Turbulent Times.
Good afternoon. We would like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging the traditional territories on which we live and work. Western Illinois University exists on the lands of the Peoria, Sauk, Meskwaki, Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux nations.
The University of Iowa is located on the territorial lands of the Sioux, Meskwaki, Sauk and Fox, and Iowa peoples. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the story of these nations. The histories and dispossession of these nations are related to the growth and expansion of higher education in the United States. We want to acknowledge and center Native peoples at the start and throughout this webinar today.
Okay, well again, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Laila McCloud. I'm an assistant professor here at Western Illinois University in the College Student Personnel Program. And as we move forward with today's important work around the issue of racial justice and decolonization within higher education, we thought it was important to really begin with how we arrive at this work. So beyond our degrees and just simply explaining all the academic work that we've done, we think it's really important to talk about how we show up at this work. So we center our introductions with Dr. Lee Patel's 3 questions, which is why us, why this, and why now? And so prior to beginning my journey as a faculty member, I was a student affairs practitioner, right? So I worked primarily at small private liberal arts colleges. And I've also only attended and worked at historically white institutions. And a lot of my work is informed by both my experiences as a Black cisgendered woman, but also during my doctoral program, I had an opportunity to reflect on the ways that I perpetuated particularly anti-Blackness in my work with students. And now transitioning to a faculty member in a graduate prep program, I feel particularly called to, as I'm socializing the next generation of educators, to disrupt some of that and have very intentional conversations. I'm also mindful that my presence as a Black woman in the classroom is often dismissed, right? And so, you know, even with this fancy degree that I now have, there's also a tension of my physical body being a site of resistance, right? Whether from the students who are hearing from me and constantly challenge what I'm saying as a Black person, regardless of my experience or education, but also getting folks to see my humanity through the work that we're doing. And I'll turn over to Alex.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex Lange. My pronouns are they, them, and their. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Iowa. You gotta emphasize candidacy once you have it, because you don't want it to slip through your grasp. In thinking about the questions Dr. Patel offers us, this comes from her really incredible book, Decolonizing Educational Research. So why me, why us? I have previously worked in sort of identity-based student services. I worked in LGBT services most recently, but I've also worked in student affairs operation and multicultural education, housing, and some other functional areas as well. And I think oftentimes, as we'll talk about later today, much of the work of racial justice, quote, or decolonization, quote, gets laid on identity-based practitioners. And while I do think the bulk of the work is put on these folks, it is actually all of our jobs to do this work. And so part of the why us in this instance is we come with both deep knowledge and an idea that this work is everyone's to take on, because that's the only way all of this will actually change. I often come to the work of racial justice and decolonization through my study of whiteness on college and university campuses. People often conflate that with studying white people. And I do study white people, but I also study the ideology of whiteness that really seeks to understand and uplift ideas of white supremacy and white dominance in society, both in sort of a local US context, but also in a global context as well. In terms of why now, Laila actually shared this on her Instagram last night, which I thought was really poignant. It was a video from James Baldwin, and he talks about how he talks about this notion of progress and the idea that, well, we just have to, we're going to get there eventually. Like, progress is this idea that we have arrived at sort of a more racially just society. And Baldwin poignantly asks, like, how long will we have to wait for progress? So for me, the racial justice and decolonization are sort of always imperative. Like, we say, why now? But we planned this webinar on like April 16th. Was the first time we talked about this idea. So in some ways, our content has shifted a little bit, but has not shifted much, right? Because this work is always and ever present. I also have personal claims in this, in that I identify as multiracial. My father has more of a German descent, but my mother has lines tracing to Jamaica, Chile, and India. And so for me, the work of racial justice and decolonization is so important, also because, like, I have literal family members that have been subject to systems of oppression, including myself, right? But race-based oppression, as someone who passes this way, is not necessarily faces those in the same way. So this has material consequences for people, and this is so important. And we want to take the time to really do this first, because I think everyone wants us to sort of jump into answers. What should we do now? Well, what do we do? What's the list? What's the book list you have? Let me compare it to the book list I have. That's great. I'm all for the book list. Actually go read them, right? That's the first thing I would offer. But we really intend for today's session to be a really based in dialogue between Laila and I. This is probably the most either of us will be taking sort of like one mic at a time kind of thing. Anything you would add, Laila, before I move on?
No, I appreciate you kind of giving folks a heads up that Alex and I are family. So this is a conversation between family members. Obviously, we have some things that we're going to cover in the upcoming slides, but you'll hear a lot of back and forth because we're also trying to model how to be in community with each other during a very stressful and frustrating and painful and frustrating and all the other adjective times. So we also want to model what it looks like to be in community in the midst of pain. And also, as we previously mentioned, the Q&A is always open. So as we're talking, if you have questions or things that you're pondering, feel free to use that as an option to engage with us. And additionally, on social media, we have our Twitter names on the slides. So feel free to engage in conversation there as well. So in true educator form, we have some learning outcomes for today's journey. We'll address differential challenges for college students amidst the pandemic, I think with a particular emphasis on Black students and Native and Indigenous students. We're going to center the framework for the strategic imperative on racial justice and decolonization that was put forth by ACPA to help us imagine a new campus environment. There's been lots of conversations about what will higher education look like this fall? We've seen how it has shifted this past spring, but we really think that this framework can help us think through how to make sure that we're bringing students back onto equitable campuses or trying to continue that conversation. And lastly, again, this is the student affairs educator in us. We want to think about what this means for your everyday practice, right? So it's not a checklist. It's not, there's no competency in this, there's a consciousness, and there's an everyday commitment to reimagining campuses, particularly for Black and Native and Indigenous students.
So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the state of the world right now, right? Part of attending to racial justice and decolonization is having both a knowledge set that we can glean from different texts, stories, podcasts, whatnot, but we also have to realize what the realities on the ground are and how they match up with what we know. And so I'll tell you all in honesty that we originally had one slide for this, right? And that was when we were planning the session in our last session before the murder of George Floyd was May 16th, right? And at that time we were thinking about, and we're still thinking about these things now, right? The various tribes, including those in South Dakota, 2 of the Sioux tribes, that are trying to take their action to protect their land from those positively tested for COVID-19 and trying to assert their rights on their land, right? And being challenged by the US government about that. The lack of ventilators in various tribal nations has been a rising concern in trying to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 for the Native population. We saw the resurgence of attention to Ahmaud Arbery's case in Georgia and the attention of Breonna Taylor. And I will say that it's still sort of enraging to me how much or how little attention Breonna Taylor gets in our discourse. And several Black women scholars have continue to point this out to us, right? That Black women, Black trans folks get often the less attention than Black men do in these instances. That's not to say this is a competition over who gets more attention, but to say that when we have to confront issues of injustice, we have to confront issues of injustice for everyone. And then we're still, despite a number of states reopening and letting folks be in crowds together, the racial disparities of COVID-19 still persist. And that is due to the material conditions often that Black and Latinx folks, who are the populations who've been most hit by COVID-19, already had to live within before the virus struck, right? So again, if we think about our current state of the world, originally when I updated the slide early last week, I was going to talk about Nina Pop, George Floyd, and Tony McDade, and now I have to add Dominique Fells, Rhea Milton, and Toyin Salau to the list as well, right? More Black folks, and 5 of those folks, Black trans folks, 4 of those folks, Black trans women, who have been murdered, right? And so, yesterday I was very heartened and grateful for the labor that went into the decision of the Supreme Court to guarantee employment protections for LGBTQ people. I'm very grateful. At the same time, 1, that means folks got to be hired first in these jobs to get those protections. And 2, it seems so ironic to me that LGBTQ folks are protected in their employment, but not in their lives, right? And that to me, it's not lost on me in this moment. We still have continued protests across the country into the response of the devaluing of Black life. I think what has been really powerful in this moment has been that even more rural places have had protests in ways that mostly the attention is on large cities, but more localities across the country have been agitating about Black life, which I think is really important about this moment. And all at the same time, campuses are still trying to figure out what they're going to do the rest of the summer and the fall semester or quarter, and how they're going to message about that. Here at Iowa, we're going to get a big email tomorrow about all the ways that we should expect to be opening up with fall, with all intention that the most people can be on campus, back on campus as possible. So we want to acknowledge that all of those things are going on and they all have connections between themselves. Some of them are a little weaker connections, some of them are stronger connections, but they're nonetheless all issues of racial justice and decolonization.
Thanks, Alex. So we're asking you all to do some dreaming with us today. And I like to begin with this idea of, we've seen different messaging around, our eyes have been opened to, particularly I'm thinking about higher education, our eyes have been opened to what's happening with our students, right? We're seeing again a rise in the uses of hashtags, even at my own institution. Black students in particular are starting to engage on social media around their experiences in and outside of the classroom, and also in the local community. And the question for me is that this is not new, or not the question, the response for me is that this isn't new. Right? The information that we've been exposed to, the books that we're including on reading lists, the movies that we're encouraging people to watch are the product of beyond decades, centuries of this conversation, right? And so Alex and I were trying to find, there was a website a couple of years ago that listed all the demands that particularly Black students have placed on their institutions. Unfortunately, the website is no longer up. But when you look at those demands, they have not changed since the kind of the influx of Black students at historically white institutions, right? The situations or the things or the experiences that Black students in particular are calling our attention to have essentially not changed, whether it's the increase of faculty and staff of color, resources, financial aid resources, support for public safety officers. Those things haven't changed. So the question that I'm encouraging our practitioners online today is to, what do you do with those lists after students prepare them? If they spend their time engaging in that work, what are the status of those demands so that when students are coming back in the fall with essentially the same list, how do we respond to that, right? And I think this goes into this idea of our institutional memory. So we know that typically, and I'm talking primarily about four-year institutions, so I want to be mindful of that. But we welcome a new group of students every fall or every semester or quarter. And so their memories are short. They don't have an understanding of the legacy of the students that have been doing this type of activism or work on their campuses. But you, as the practitioner or the faculty member, have that memory in some cases. We also know that student affairs has a high turnover rate, but sometimes you've been there long enough where you've seen some of this before, or you've been in higher education long enough where you've seen some of this before. So how do we take on that role of being proactive and allowing students, particularly marginalized, racially minoritized students, to be students and not, they can still engage in activism, but they're also there to get an education and to live out all the dreams and promises that we've asked, or that they're asking of the institution. So if we're, in my opinion, taking away that opportunity for students to be students, but instead they're trying to address the issues that their predecessors 30 years ago were also asking of the institution, where is our memory? What are we doing with the documents that students are spending precious time? They're not getting paid for this. This is no way to capture this on their transcript, the labor that they're doing. So I'm just curious, those are some of the questions that always come up for me when I see these trends kind of happen on campus. I'm thinking about in 2013 when students at UCLA or Harvard or Michigan did the Black At campaign, where they produced these beautiful videos talking about their experiences. Or even in 2015, where Concerned Student 1950 campaign, where students started to do this. So we have a trend in recent memory where students are asking us the same things, and it's become painfully obvious that we're not listening.
Yeah, I think that for me, Laila, it's interesting because there's sort of a fascination with lists, right, that I referenced a little bit earlier, but it seems like students have been providing us lists for a while and those haven't been taken up, right? And I'm sure that our good folks who are student journalists have, if our institutions haven't maintained these demands, they will probably have access to them or a record of them somewhere. And we know that folks sort of like wait students out, right? Part of the goal of creating committees or task force or whatnot is to say, let's just do this thing over here. We're going to plan for this. And whether intentionally or unintentionally, you're probably not going to see the fruits and results of this labor, because those that we're going to invite to the table are probably going to be juniors or seniors if they're at four-year institutions. And then we're going to sort of just disperse from there. So I think that these are all important things to think about as we think about racial justice and decolonization. In addition to what Laila offered, I would also say that this work concerns all of us. As I referenced in the beginning, we as a field really focus on students, right? It's sort of our job. If you do a close reading of the history of higher ed, you'll know that faculty originally had this work, and both because of the demands put on them, as well as for some others, the abdication of that responsibility. The student affairs profession slowly began to emerge from deans of men and women at institutions, and then sort of the student personnel movement took off in around the 1920s. And so we're used to really taking care of students, but I would also encourage us to think about how do we take care of one another and our colleagues. As someone who isn't working in a full-time role currently, I'm a full-time doctoral student right now, is that I've wondered about our colleagues who have to sit in meetings and talk about like advising as students are coming on campus while dealing with the murder of George Floyd, while dealing with the murder of Breonna Taylor, while dealing with the murder of Tony McDade, right? And how we check in with one another and how we do this work, not just for students, but for each other as a campus community, is so important to me. And I think that the other thing that I would emphasize is that the work of justice really requires the fullness of our humanity to engage in it. I think there was a tweet I saw 2 weeks ago. I forget who the account was, but they had a sort of Lisa Simpson picture, and it was like, last week was not Black Lives Matter Spirit Week, right? This is lifetime work. And this is, I know a number of friends and even close family who are sort of are coming to this work now and have asked for tips and sort of gotten burnt out in the process. And I think that's because mainly they were just using their outrage to guide them for 2 to 3 weeks. And I would say that the work of justice requires joy and utilizing our anger each day to make change happen. I think of Ruby Sales, who is an activist in the Southern Freedom Movement and continues to be to this day. And she talks about that we have to have a conversation that incorporates a vision of love with a vision of outrage in doing justice work. Because if we only hate injustice, how much do we love justice? Right? Part of the work of doing this work is saying, I actually love the idea of justice and I hate the idea of injustice.
Right.
But if I only hate the idea of injustice, I'm not actually envisioning a new world.
Right.
I actually think this is sort of why the abolitionist movement has really reemerged in the dominant public conversation, because abolition is not about is about presence. It's not about absence. It's about dreaming of new possibilities. And so thinking about the fullness of our humanity while we engage in this work is so important. So there's at least one question I want to answer now. And Simona Simpkins, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name, asks, where does hope enter into the work we do? And for me, Brian Stevenson, who wrote the book Just Mercy that became sort of a very popular movie, and that has done a lot of work around prison reform, talks about protecting hopefulness as a key component of justice work, right? We have to be able to protect the idea that things will change. If we're so if we're so resigned to thinking that nothing will change, then what's the point of doing the work to begin with?
Right.
That I think is really hard. Would you have others that you would offer that, Laila?
I mean, I would say it also removes us from this idea that only certain people can be engaged in this work, right? So some of the things that keep coming up for me when having conversations with folks is like, well, I'm not an expert, right? Or I need to do more reading. And I'm like, it seems like we're more interested in consuming or reading about violence against Black people than actually doing something about it. So for me, it's like, what is the tipping point for you? How do you know when you've done enough of that to actually move to action, right? So I think the hope also just gives us a different space and to imagine what action looks like versus waiting for someone else to tap me and say, okay, I can go, right? Because that, I think that's also the function of this idea of experts, or the ways, particularly in student affairs, you know, we're very siloed into functional areas. So all of a sudden I have to operate in this little box, and that only people that are in this particular office or in this particular space can do this type of work. And so that's a way, and I know we'll talk about this later, maybe I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but this idea of only certain people can do certain things. And hope, I think, is a way to kind of to liberate us from that, right? But it also liberates us in the sense that certain people think that they don't have any more to learn, right? Because of maybe the social identities that they have or the way that they move in the world, that we all have some learning and unlearning to do, right? So that's something that I also sit with that question.
And I'll be honest, the organic nature of our conversation, I'm trying to scan the Q&A and pay attention to our conversation. So if we don't get to your question during our conversation, we do have time at the end that we really want to dive into some of these others. If we see that one really fits in well, we'll definitely insert it, just to let y'all know. But please keep coming with the questions. Before diving into sort of two of our conversation points, we think it's important to raise ACPA, College Student Educators International. Yes, that is their whole name. The framework that they have pushed forward as for their strategic imperative on racial justice and decolonization. I should say that I'm also one of the authors of this document. So I both really strongly believe in it, and I have some different attachments than others to it.
I hope so.
Right? You would really hope. And so I want to just go over the framework really briefly for folks who maybe haven't been exposed to it, and say that this is sort of one sort of mental model folks can take up in this work, but that by all means there are several ways of thinking about racial justice and decolonization. So if you think of the circle model, if for those of you who can see it on your screen on the left, if you think of this as a clock, I'm going to start with the sort of outer rim of the analog clock, and that is this sort of dark gray band really represents the idea of history, of attending to both the past, the present, and the future. So we can understand history as helping us understand that certain structures were put into place to create our current conditions, right? And that part of the work of racial justice and decolonization is thinking of a future where we liberate each other from those structures and conditions and create new modes of being together. If we then zoom right into the center, into that big capital worded love, right? We agreed as a collective that love sort of is the core of the model. Many people treat love as sort of this amorous or sexual idea, and of course it is that. But we really think of love as a practice, as a way of being rather than a feeling. I think of Dean Spade's work on this often of love is the sincere wish that another person has what they need to be whole and develop themselves to their best capacity for joy or whatever fulfillment they're seeking, right? It's not that, and I should say that there's sort of a 23-page document that accompanies this model that I would encourage folks to check out. But part of this that we wrote in the document is like, if students come to us and say, I don't know where I'm getting food tonight, my response as an educator is not, wow, let me write a learning outcome about that, about how I can teach you about where to find food right now. That is not what I would hope is, that is not our reaction. And our hope is our reaction is actually grounded in our practice of love and trying to take care of this student who's named a need that they have and they don't know how to resolve that need. And then what we call the veins are the 9 they're 9 principles, not 10. That's my typo, around the model. And this is how we can begin to actualize the work of racial justice and decolonization. And all of them are sort of interrelated. And again, if we picture this as an analog clock, I would start sort of at that 12:30 big hand of questioning the knowledges that we use. What knowledges have we typically relied on to structure higher education? Which have we relied on less? Often sort of positivist scientific method theory frameworks really guide our construction of what education is, and critical liberatory frameworks often do not. As we keep moving, I'm gonna have to rush. I'm not rushing through these, but I'm trying to give a short synopsis of each. Emphasizing agency. So how do we both take our responsibility as educators to do this work, but also value individual students' agency to do the work as well. It's not about putting it all on them or putting it all on us, but sort of saying, what are the parts each of us is willing to take up? And then we as educators got to take up more of those parts, right? At 3 o'clock, we have developing authentic relationships, really grounded in mutuality and humility for one another. This isn't just, hey, I saw you at our division meeting and that's great, I see you there once a year, right? But actually developing authentic relationships within campuses and across campuses to really think about the work of racial justice and decolonization. At sort of your 4:30 time, we have watching out for each other. Now I'm gonna think at 4:30 today, I need to watch out for each other. That was the joke you're all getting in the session, congratulations. I know you're all laughing out there so hard about that joke. Thank you, Laila, I appreciate it.
I do what I can.
But I think it's how do we approach one another with trust and care, and how do we help envision a world where we're not expecting other people or other systems to watch for people or surveil them, but actually sort of like making sure to take care of one another in this way. Related to that is centering compassion and healing. Often the work of racial injustice and colonization has created a lot of trauma for folks, right? And so how do we heal from that trauma? How do we do that for ourselves and for others? Part of centering compassion and healing is also to hold folks accountable, right, to what they do, so that we can move to compassion and healing in that way. As we keep moving around, we go to suspending efficiency and embracing dialogue. I think this is one that a lot of folks have trouble with, including myself. I think efficiency comes from this notion that things have to be done in a certain regimented way that maximizes the energy we use to maximize the product. Whereas dialogue really focuses on both reflecting and acting, and really tries to reflect an intellectual fellowship that we can develop between one another as we think of making decisions. As we think of how campuses are going to decide to open or not this fall, right? How much of that has been top-down decision-making? How much of that has been collective decision-making by some people at certain levels? How much of that is open to change in forums, right? So Iowa's going to have like 7 open forums about tomorrow's email after it comes out to answer questions. And my big question is, will anything anyone says change this? Or is this just giving everybody a chance to say, well, this is what I think about this. That's great. We're going to just keep doing this, right? And scaling that on our campuses is by no means an easy task, but it's a necessary task. And Always Becoming really emphasizes that we have to continue to adapt to the changes in the system. It's the idea that there's no arrival point in this work. I think Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow, really demonstrates this, that systems will always adapt to oppress others. And so how do we think about ourselves adapting and continuing to learn as we continue to move forward. And then the last two are responsibility rather than compliance. So this idea that just because we aren't told we need to do something doesn't mean we don't need to do something. I think often of this Title IX legislation and sort of the new guidance that has come out from the Department of Education. And so just because we're told we don't need to do these things, does that mean we don't do them anymore? Those kinds of things. And then finally, education through problem posing. This is really comes from the work of Paulo Freire and thinking about how do we do education that is dialogic in nature, rather than sort of this idea that people come to college and we just, we open their heads and we just throw knowledge in and then they leave, right? The sort of banking idea of education. That's a very simplified version of what the banking idea of education is. And then finally, both the love and the 9 principles are enclosed in this smaller circle with sort of 3 humps of what are the actual desired and actualized goals of racial justice and decolonization. And that looks like critical consciousness, radical democracy, and humanization. So we think of these as outcomes of what happens when so much of this work is actualized, but also processes themselves. For instance, recognizing that we don't treat often Black, Brown, and Indigenous students as human on our campus. They are either subhuman or they are superhuman, right? They are amazing because they navigate all this stuff and we just want to reward them for all that work. But that superhumanization also is a form of dehumanization, right? I think particularly Black women face this. They are so powerful, they still leave their families, they do all of this stuff, which is incredible and great. And gosh, does that make us often think that Black women don't deserve humanity in that way too, right? So that is the sort of overview of the framework of the strategic imperative. Oh wow, you all have a lot of questions, and I'm gonna turn it over to Laila to keep talking while I look through some of them.
Yeah. So and you can go. So I'm going to focus on, there's a lot in the model. Someone asked a question. This is available on ACPA's website. If you type in strategic imperative, you'll find it. There's a PDF document where it explains, all of this in more detail. But for the purpose of this conversation and time, I'm going to focus on 2 of the veins that really resonate, I think. And I think someone had a question about, is this model or this framework focused on, person-to-person interaction? How can we talk about it with systems? And I think it's the flexibility is there. So I want to try to talk through some examples of what that looks like. So if you want to go to the next slide. As we think about how we're communicating with our students, I also want to think about how we're communicating with each other. Because I think, again, Alex kind of introduced this idea to us a little bit ago, but I think sometimes and this is good, we're thinking about students, obviously that's why we're doing this work, but it's like we're so focused on students that we don't even check in with each other, right? And so you're thinking about, oh, how do I support my Black students? You haven't even reached out to the Black colleague that you sit in meetings or sit in Zoom meetings every day with, right? And so thinking about what relationships do you have, or do you only interact with certain offices when these instances come up? Right? Or thinking about in terms of the knowledge, when I think about questioning the knowledge we use, if we recognize that higher education was born out of anti-Black racism, right? Or, anti-Native, these institutions were built on stolen land by enslaved labor, right? That's a fact, that's not up for debate. That's something that we know to be historically true, but it's something that we continue to shy away from that still has real implications all these years later. So thinking about the knowledge that we use, if we understand the roots of how we understand higher education, then we're asking different questions, right? And so in times of unrest, I think someone also put this in the questions, if the default is to shift the labor to our offices of multicultural student affairs, to our chief diversity officers, what is everybody else doing? right? Everyone else that has the same, and I'm thinking particularly folks who have come out of higher ed programs, if everyone has the same training and loves to talk about how their program is social justice oriented, then you all should have the same capacity to engage in this conversation regardless of the office that you occupy. Right? And so how do we make sure that we're not placing additional labor on certain folks based upon their identities or where they work to do these things? Because our students interact or should be interacting with all these spaces. So we should all have the capacity to do this type of work, right? And so when we deem people as experts, what are we really saying? I guess would be my question. Or if we tell people to go here, this is the place that you go to for that, how are we perpetuating this idea of superhumanness, this idea of anti-Blackness, by saying that only certain people can do this work, and so I get to sit back and let them labor while I do these, whatever this other work is that I'm doing. So just in the way that we're organized as a system perpetuates this idea of anti-Blackness, right? So we have to start asking different questions about who is charged. You'll see also increase in these job titles. So now maybe every office has an inclusion coordinator or diversity coordinator. Well, what was everybody else doing? Right? Like, or I think about it as a faculty member when I see there's a multicultural teaching award and a teaching award. Well, shouldn't all teaching be multicultural teaching? Right? So we're perpetuating this idea that only certain people can do certain things in certain ways. And I think addressing that is one important place to start. In addition, when we think about the spaces that we allot for students, now, I'm a firm believer in the power of cultural centers. As an undergraduate student, that was a safe space for me. But at the same time, when we deem those as the only space students with certain identities can be free, what are we saying about the rest of the campus that they also pay tuition to use? Right? What is our commitment to making that space, the entire environment, a space where all students can be free, versus saying this building, this room, this closet in some campuses, right, is the only space for you. Once you leave, I can't guarantee your safety. What messaging are we communicating to students about their sense of belonging and sense of community on campus when they're relegated to these particular spaces with this one overworked staff member who is also dealing with their own trauma of being isolated from their colleagues? Right? So we're thinking about, yes, it is the individual, but there's also, we've been very intentional within higher education about creating these systems to maintain violence. Right? Some of us are like, this kept me a job. I say if I stayed as a director of multicultural student affairs, I'd always have a job because I'm constantly trying to think about how or the ways that we hyper marginalize students. And I say this as someone who is actively involved in this. So I'm not exempt from this. And I think that's really important to acknowledge that the work that we're doing or that I'm now critiquing is stuff that I was a part of. So I'm not above any of this, but thinking about the ways that we perpetuate these systems, the way that we hyper marginalize students, as Alex was saying earlier, about whether it's the labels that we give to students and saying, wow, we're surprised you made it. Here's a stole. Or here's your photo on the cover of every magazine on campus as our success story, right? And I'm upset, I never got on the cover or anything. But you know what I'm saying? So the ways that we hype up these students as success because we're not really interested in removing the barriers for them. So those are the things that sit with me. How do we help students imagine this new way of being? They've given us this long list. They said, okay, you all are the ones that are making decisions, but we're instead creating more barriers for them to limit their ability to move freely across the campus. So those are the things that I'm thinking about as it relates to those two items, questioning the knowledge we use. Someone else, I just really quickly want to jump on this. Someone had mentioned particularly about Greek life. And one of the things, and I say this, I'm a 20-year member of a sorority, and one of the things that always come up for me with Greek life, given its prevalence on many campuses, is that the way that we talk about culturally based organizations and I guess non-culturally based organizations as a way to perpetuate this idea that IFC and Panhellenic organizations are not rooted in culture, white culture. Right? So again, the language that we use, the way that we hyper marginalize particular groups on campus as culturally based, again, if we understand the way that whiteness works in the US, all of these organizations are culturally based. And it again pushes this idea that only certain people have culture, only certain people do certain things, when those of us that work in maybe with student organizations realize that all these organizations are rooted in some kind of racialized understanding of culture. But when we position it as only certain people do certain things, we're perpetuating this idea that hyper marginalizes students. And the students feel it, they're aware of it, but also they're there to get a degree, in my opinion, not to figure out how to dismantle these systems that we as practitioners are heavily invested in maintaining. Okay. This idea of historicizing Native and Indigenous students on campus, right? So this idea that there are spaces in our union where the images of Native and Indigenous folks are historical photos. And that's common on campus, is this idea of like something that happened a long time ago. How do we understand the future and the current and the now of this population of people, right? If they're only presented in something of the past, that we're kind of ignorant of the fact that, no, the folks are still living and thriving amidst the ridiculous racism and the ways that the land has been just, disrupted and co-opted and all those things and essentially stolen. Thinking about how do we understand that population when the only images or the only conversations we have are related to history, right? And I think again about how that relates to, Black folks, at University of Iowa, which is where I did my doctorate. In the union, there are again photos of historical photos of Black students. I think some of the earlier Black students at the University of Iowa, again, these historical things that separates you from what's happening now. And so I do think there needs to be a conversation about when we talk about these legacies, how do we connect it to what's happening now to kind of disrupt this idea that this is all a surprise or that this is new, right? The conversations that I remember having 20 years ago as a freshman in college were the same conversations my mom had almost 50 years ago as someone graduating from college. Like, how do we stop sitting in the historical moment, but also this constant consumption of Black pain, this idea that unless there's a hashtag to it where we rush to read, that this stuff doesn't exist. And so how do we move from this ongoing consumption of violence against Black and Indigenous bodies to actually caring beyond it? Like, how much more do you need to read? So I think it goes back, or not only how much do you need to read, but actually, are you doing the reading, right? Are you doing the reading that's been assigned to you or that has been presented to you and across lens and sitting with things that make you uncomfortable, and prioritizing not prioritizing your own comfort in moments where you're seeing violence against human beings. So again, this idea of, do we see each other's humanity? Is it always something that's out there? It's those people when you're actually dealing with humans on your campus, in your office, virtually, like you're seeing people. How do you move beyond this abstract to the actual people that you're doing life with? So again, I think this idea of developing authentic relationships, yes, that's a individual conversation, but it's also when we think about the ways that our offices work, how do you collaborate with different offices? How can you be proactive and thinking about the ways to address the issues of siloing that happens within our field to promote the liberation of Black and Indigenous students?
Every time I have to talk, I'm like, I have to follow Laila, and I'm just like,
oh, please.
The brilliant.
Well, not when I'm muted, so sorry. Sorry about
that. Just because I want to make sure we have time for some of the questions you all are asking. The other thing that we've been thinking about is sort of like, how do we think about this racial justice and decolonization and preparing for the current and upcoming academic year? It's not like, I think for many people who are particularly at sort of R1 research university experiences, we forget that there's a summer session going on currently, and that folks are navigating these decisions right now. So as we make decisions for the forthcoming school year, the current school year, you know, to reiterate some of the points Laila's talked about, like how much are we going to rely on students guiding the way versus our knowledge of what's happening? I think oftentimes the labor is really on students to make change happen. And like, for many of us, we have sort of advanced degrees in this stuff, but yet we're like, let's just, you know, as someone who studies student development and believes in its power, I say this with a full throat, right? I think like there are other ways to promote student development besides making students do all the work, right? And so,
sorry,
here we are. And sort of one thing I would really challenge us on, and Laila and I talk about this often, is that I think a lot of us have the assumption that because a student has X identity means that they contained Y knowledge about oppression.
Ooh.
And I really want us to challenge this idea, because I will tell you that ideologies of white supremacy can live in anybody. It's not just white folks. Ideologies of anti-Blackness could live in anybody. Ideologies of colonization can live in anybody. And so this idea that, and I think this goes to a question about at the table that I think is really important, like who is missing. If our only count of who is at the table is about like a diversity checklist count in terms of identity, I think we're doing a real disservice to the idea of change work on our campuses, because we have to also think about, well, what kinds of ideas are around the table too? Is it just about having a Native student around the table when we talk about Indigenous Peoples Day and we're like, good, does that person have a tribal affiliation, right? Like, what does that look like? And so we really have to start asking these questions in meaningful ways. And for some folks, asking these questions are very uncomfortable, and I get that.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean we don't ask them, though.
Right.
And then what expectations can we as professionals take back from students? That, I mean, again, we've really put a lot of the labor on them to figure this out. You know, I have offered students in the past and said, do you need someone to pull together all the research on why a bad campus climate isn't good for you that you can then present to the president? I don't need any, like, I don't require any credit for you doing that. But can I do that for you so you don't have to do that because I study this for a living, right? It's these kinds of things that we've asked students to sort of compile, and we're absolutely stunned when they do it themselves. But like, I would rather be stunned that they had an amazing college experience without an experience of oppression.
What?
I'm sorry. Well, I'm on a roll right now. So I also think this is really important. This is a question we got on Twitter before we even did this session, but like, how does the pace of our response match the urgency of the moment while being thoughtful about the work to be done? And I am here to tell you there's no magic answer to this question, but I've got to tell you, I'm a little skeptical of solutions that are going to happen in the next month for college campuses, because I think they're going to be based on money. I think they're going to be based on PR issues. I think they're going to be so college presidents can alleviate their discomfort and the idea that students are going to show up at their houses on campus and demand change. There have been some really good, thoughtful pieces from some folks in both the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed about this that I would encourage you to read, and I'm happy to tweet those out after the session is done. And then, but part of we're trying to overturn 400 plus years of injustice. That is not going to happen with a DEI plan. I'm sorry, but it's just not going to happen as that being the only way this works. It is a component of a larger strategy, for sure. Don't take away that Alex Lange hates DEI plans.
No.
What Alex Lange is saying is that they have to be one part of a greater strategy to do this work.
Right.
And then also, like, how and this is also tough work, is like how, as all of this is, how do you, your unit, your division, your campus acknowledge these realities in an ongoing, meaningful way? You know, I think students, unfortunately, because of COVID, are so tired of another Zoom meeting or another email. And how can we think of using things like dashboards or other things that students can go to websites and sort of see updates, rather than always us having us message something out, which often is about us alleviating our guilt about not saying something, than it is for something meaningful to be said to those students. Okay. So we want to make sure we get to some of your questions with some of our time remaining. I think this one I want to do is from Robin Phelps Ward. First of all, thank you for laughing at my joke. But second, so if any of you have not opened the Q&A yet, you can actually open the Q&A, see the open questions still, and if there are questions that you would like maybe answered more, use that like feature. It helps bring the questions up. But the question about like folks sort of touting newfound expertise is a big one. And I think anyone with a Twitter realizes how many people have sort of always been woke to whiteness, apparently, just haven't said anything before. I think that this is an opportunity where I really, part of my thinking about change work is it doesn't need to be me, but it needs to be someone who does it. So I often find the people that person will listen to. And trying to get, so if I have a colleague, like I've had a number, who maybe I don't have the best relationship with, they often see me as combative for some reason, when I think I'm like a really nice person. I should say I'm a very kind person. I don't know if I'm a nice person. And they are doing something I'm like, really, really, Bob, really today? I'm sorry if there are any Bobs on the call. And I go find someone Bob will listen to instead of me, right? And be like, I don't know if this is the way to approach that work, or through this framework, or through this model. Here's what I would recommend instead, right? And so it takes me out of the equation of having to be the one to do this with Bob, but also to be like, reminding folks, if you are new, the newer you are to the game, the more humble you should be about the game, in my opinion. There have been folks who've been doing abolition thinking and writing, for instance, for generations before me. And I have become much more like recently on board with the ideas of abolition. That's because I've done deep reading and been really open to being critiqued about it. But that's a posture I adopt, and I know some people don't adopt that posture, and so I think it's like trying to remind people where their learning edges should be versus sort of like their speaking edges at this point. So that's what I would think initially based on that question. Laila, do you have other things you would offer to that?
No, I think you.
Do you have another question you want to?
Let's see. I want to say, I want to make sure we get to, I don't see it anymore, but Romeo had a question about the intersection of gender and sexuality can I find it?
It's, can you chat a bit about the connections between racial justice and decolonization and gender and sexuality work on campus? How do they intersect?
Why can't I'm sorry, I can't find where I can read it, but thank you for reading it out loud. I mean, I think for me, and this is an ongoing thing, that I don't see them as exclusive. And I guess that's just how I move through the world. I think, again, it goes to my point about the ways that higher education or student affairs in particular likes to silo things out to make us seem like you talk about these things in this room, you talk about these things in this room. But as a Black cisgender woman, I'm always conscious of those things. I'm conscious of the ways that when I'm talking about Black women, I'm talking about all Black women, right? Like, to me, we need to make sure we're thinking about those things. If I'm talking about Black students, I'm talking about all Black students, I'm talking about queer Black students, I'm talking about trans Black students, right? I'm talking about all of that. And so I think for me, it's also a conversation about the language that we use and how we like to siphon things out or silo things out, again, that only certain people can do certain things, instead of seeing the full humanity of folks that are in front of us. Like, I'm not one thing at one time, right? And this idea of saliency, I think also I struggle with, because it's like I don't know that I can slice myself up in that way. So that's how I approach this work, and I encourage folks to think about that too, that when we're thinking about particular populations of students, that we're thinking about the ways that all of this comes together, that these students are not just one thing on Saturday, another thing on Sunday, you know, whatever. But you know what I'm saying? Like, this very limited view of, in my opinion, of gender and sexuality as something separate. Because I think I'm always moving in that way all the time. But that's how I approach and try to get us to have those conversations. But I definitely think that our field needs to do that. I also think the framework, sorry, I'm trying to visualize it in my mind. The framework also encourages that overlap or that cyclical nature, that those things are always moving at the same time, right? And so I think the wheel also gives us, if you're a visual, you see I'm moving my hands, I'm a visual person, this idea that these things are always moving at the same time. They're not, oh, let me stop off here. No, these things feed into each other. You see the dotted lines, those things should be feeding into each other. But because of the way that our structures are created in student affairs, we don't see that. And we are very, again, in my opinion, very intent on drawing hard lines between those things. And thus our students are constantly saying, well, I don't feel included in this space. I don't feel included in that space. Well, we as practitioners have been very adamant about making that the case, right? So all students should, I mean, I'm thinking about Black students coming into, I'm thinking particularly about Black students, and thinking about the stories that I've read about, you know, particularly Black trans male students or men students thinking, oh, I can't come into this space, or having these experiences of not being welcome in certain spaces. It's like, well, I also think we as practitioners have set that environment up that way, right? And that assumption that folks, because of their identities, as Alex said earlier, just know how to do certain things. Why would we expect them to engage in these ways? Why do we assume that certain students, because of their identities, know how to do these things? We can be prepared to help set that space up and to engage them in those conversations, so that the students can have the joy of being students and being free and being seen fully for who they are. Like, to me, that's our work as the folks that have the degrees and are done with, you know, quote unquote, done with school. I don't know, Alex, if you had something to add.
Yeah, I would say the other thing I would say, I would add, I have a lot of thoughts on this, but this idea of who's included in our Safe Zone 101 trainings and what ideas of people are included in 201 trainings always fascinates me, because often we're picturing white folks as being censored in Safe Zone trainings, white folks with LGBT, sometimes trans identities, being included in those trainings. And so I think about who, in the formalized forms of this work, whose life experiences do we center, and who's our quote unquote, as some students have literally told me in the past, too complex for a 101 training. It's too much to think about, but these folks have to actually live their lives these ways. So we are over time.
Yeah.
Jill, do we have maybe time for maybe one or two more questions?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'll answer Tristan's question really quickly about as a new professional or as an educator that feels a pushback from departments. One of my greatest powers as a new professional was the ability to ask questions that sounded very innocent, but wanted me to try and help promote thinking in departments as well. So I would as a new professional, I often was given a lot of permission to sort of ask, why is this done this way? Whereas in my third year on the job, that came off as maybe a different kind of question than I did in my first year. So I'd really encourage you to sort of use your newness as an ability to problem pose in these situations and really think through how to respond to some of these incidences. Anything else you would offer about that, Laila?
No, I think the problem posing is a great tactic of how to think through those things. And again, it goes back to the point of just questioning the knowledge. Like, you're asking, how did we get here? How do we get to the decision that this is the norm and this is the way that things should always be? When it's been clear through student the way that students are acting, the way that your colleagues are acting, that it's not working, right? So this idea of, certain things may work for a certain few, like asking the question of just having people be able to articulate. I think it's a skill that we also need to be able to articulate how we've arrived at how we understand the work that we do, right? So I say this again as a faculty member in our program, we do a lot of reflection, and it's not just because we don't, as faculty, don't have anything else to do or want to read other things. It's because we want to get you into the habit of understanding or thinking through why you believe what you believe, because that impacts why you practice the way that you practice, or why you will respond to certain students in certain ways. And so if you don't build a habit of asking those questions of yourself as a practitioner, and then being able to ask it of your colleagues that you're working with, and you also hopefully will model that for students, like, it's a ripple effect. But if you just accept things the way that they are, and every year, like, oh, so for example, every fall we know there's going to be a racist Halloween party, we just kind of accept it, right? We just say, oh, it's coming. We may do like a 30-minute workshop, say, don't do that, but we know that they're going to do that, right? And so how do we kind of ask different questions about why do people feel the need to do that? What are the conditions that make that an acceptable thing to do that causes harm on campuses every fall? We know it's coming. You can almost set a watch to it. But our response is more trainings, more readings, more social media posts, instead of asking different questions about the behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the problem posing presents another way to get at those things, particularly as a new professional, even seasoned professionals. As you move up and interact with different people, you have to learn how to ask different questions.
Right. I think I want to honor the two folks who are also helping us run logistics in the background and things they need to do. So Jill, how about we conclude here, and maybe Laila and I can brainstorm about ways to maybe address some of these other questions.
That sounds great.
Do you want to give the closing, and then we'll maybe jump back into questions as people have time?
Oh, okay. So I'm going to do it. Sorry. I just want to thank, obviously, Alex, for spending time with us today. It's always good to be with family. But I also want to thank, again, our sponsor, Shirley Moore with the Grad Center, and obviously Kelly Larrabee and Jill Bisbee, our wonderful staff here at Western Illinois. Kelly is in the Office of Graduate Studies, and Jill is with the College Student Personnel Graduate Program here at Western. We just want to thank our sponsors and our hosts today for just helping us with this webinar. We also want to thank all of you that joined us today. Feel free to continue the conversation with us either online, or you feel free to, to email us to continue this conversation, because we genuinely hope that this is an ongoing conversation, that this is not a spirit week in terms of supporting Black and Indigenous students in particular on college campuses.
And Jill, I forgot to put our emails on here. Will you include our email addresses when you send out the link next week?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank y'all. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.